Waifei Peninsula isn't just Chinese. The inspiration for the Season 2 region of Zenless Zone Zero has a little bit more nuance than just that. And those small details about this new region may have just given us some clarity on the world building and history of New Eridu, as Waifei Peninsula's inspiration may actually give us a hint of all of the future regions in ZZZ. So today we're going to go over what exactly inspired Waifei Peninsula, why that inspiration is going to be important to the wider Zenless universe, and what exactly are the cultural inspirations for the future regions of ZZZ. But before that, if you like these types of theories and explanation videos, let me know by liking and subscribing. And as always, leave your own thoughts and theories in the comments below. With that being said, let's just jump right into it. As I mentioned before, Waifei Peninsula isn't just Chinese. It's actually specifically inspired by Hong Kong and Cantonese culture. And as someone who spent a lot of his childhood in Hong Kong, seeing this really makes me when I first saw the Season 2 trailer for ZZZ, there are a few things that immediately popped up that screamed to me Hong Kong. And the first thing was the food. In the beginning of the trailer, there was a lady who was selling tong soi, which is a classic style Cantonese dessert that's basically a sweet pudding or soup that can be made from nuts, sesame seeds, fruit, or sweet beans, depending on the specific dish. There are tong soi parlors everywhere in Hong Kong. Probably one of the most commonly eaten desserts there. By the way, one of my favorites is Kai Kai in Jordan, just so you know if you're ever in the area. Another food that is immediately noticeable is the restaurant Pan Yi Hu recommended, which has quote Yum Cha in its name. Yum Cha directly translates to drink tea in Cantonese, and it's a phrase that refers to going to eat dim sum. Dim sum, if you don't know, is a style of Chinese food that is a variety of small fried or steamed dishes that's typically eaten with tea. I describe it kind of like Chinese version of tapas, but with tea instead of wine. The phrase yum cha is actually a reference to the origins of dim sum, which was originally just tea houses all over Guangdong that was serving snacks, and the snacks eventually became more of the main focus of the restaurants. And dim sum is everywhere in Hong Kong. I cannot undermine how big of an influence dim sum is in Hong Kong. There's versions that are cheap street foods and others that are super high-end restaurants. Seeing a yum cha parlor in Waifei is very clearly a reference to the dim sum restaurants in Hong Kong. Now, there's definitely more than just food in terms of references to Hong Kong, as the hanging store signs are actually a staple of Hong Kong's unique aesthetic. You can see a side-by-side here between Waifei Peninsula and the streets of Kowloon Peninsula, and it's damn near an exact replica. Also, the gate that leads to the food market in the beginning of the trailer might have been a reference to the Temple Street Gate and the night market in Jordan. It was mentioned by Yi Xuan that Waifei Peninsula is where New Eridu's porcelain originates, making it a big industry that is controlled by tops. This is supposed to be a reference to porcelain, and Hong Kong has a big history with hand-painted porcelain that originates all the way back to the 20th century. It was a key factor in making Hong Kong a major trading port connecting the Chinese and Western world. Now, the biggest and probably the most important inspiration that ZZZ took from Hong Kong is the Kung Fu films that were popularized by the Hong Kong film industry. Their Kung Fu films gave rise to stars like Jet Li, Jackie Chan, and of course, Bruce Lee. This is an important note because we know that Season 2 will have a huge emphasis on martial arts mysticism and Kung Fu culture, as it's been confirmed that the siblings will be staying at Soiban Temple and learning martial arts and how to better control their newfound abilities by Yi Xuan. They even refer to her as Sifu, which is translated to wise master or teacher, most often used in Kung Fu or martial arts settings. It was confirmed that the siblings' eye abilities bear resemblances to the mystic crafts that Yung Kuei's Summit teaches, which doubles down on the classic Kung Fu mysticism and cultivation tropes that are still popular to this day in China. And Yi Xuan calls her disciples seekers, which is a term often used in Kung Fu stories and manhua to refer to those who are driven by relentless pursuit of strength and mastery, beyond the confines of given martial arts style. Think of it kind of like Super Saiyans in Dragon Ball Z. And to double down on the whole Kung Fu culture film inspirations, they have the Dragon Warrior himself in ZZZ. Probably not played by Jack Black, but a boy can hope. As a slight tangent, before we get into what this all may mean for the wider Star Rail story, I saw a few comments in the Season 2 trailer that basically said, oh, not another Chinese region. And I want to clarify before I say anything else that I by no means am bashing that person or you if you have the same opinion. Because to be honest, I kind of somewhat agree. But as someone who's been able to grow up with both the Chinese and the Western culture, I wanted to explain why we might be seeing another Chinese-inspired region and what nuances nuances there are to that decision, because it's actually a little bit deeper than you might think. The obvious first point is that Hoyo is a Chinese company based in Shanghai and with big Chinese audiences. And these types of tropes of martial arts, mysticism, kung fu, and cultivation are all common story tropes in China and very beloved ones as well. When I was visiting China for a couple months, I could not tell you the amount of video game ads and movie ads and film ads that were based around the romance of the Three Kingdoms, kung fu, cultivation, mysticism, martial arts, all of that jazz. The way I would kind of describe it is that if you're from America or even the West as a whole, it's kind of like how we don't even bat an eye at any stories that involve the army, cowboys, and Native Americans, and country farms, and even when we go into the fantasy setting, things like knights, wizards, Vikings, and elves, and dwarves, and stuff like that. Like, we don't bat an eye at any of that at all now. And to add on that, with the influence of anime and Japanese film culture, we don't bat an eye at katanas, or samurais, or ninjas, or hell, Japanese school life. So we are so used to these tropes that it's not weird to see. We're not used to seeing Chinese kung fu tropes, really. And I mean, outside of Hoyo games, Black Myth Wukong, and kung fu inspired films, it's not something we commonly see, and so we're naturally going to notice it more if there's a consistent use of it. But it's an opposite of a Chinese audience because these are extremely popular tropes, as it highlights pride in their culture. Now, in terms of like a deeper reasoning, based on the conversations I had with family that works in the Chinese entertainment and media industry, there is a bit of a push and an incentive to produce stories that are inspired by Chinese culture, tropes, and settings, usually highlighting them in a pretty positive light most of the time. There's a little leeway, but most of the time. It's no surprise that for China, the most consistent favorite character for Star Rail is Jing Yuan. Now, I'm not going to say that's the exact reason for this, but it's no surprise that all the internationally popular Hoyo games has their second region based in a Chinese setting. If I had to guess, it's kind of like meeting the quota. So they use the first region that is a little bit more applicable to a wider international audience to draw in players. As the players are already in the game, they start introducing that second region that has a little bit more of these nuances and niche Chinese culture references. Does that mean it's going to be a bad story? No, they still have to perform well. Like, the characters still have to be likable and the story has to at least be pretty good, be successful. But those stories will have to involve some sort of Chinese cultural influences in them. And to them, it's just the name of the game. I mean, think about how much percentage of anime and manga is based in Japanese culture. Now, I want to clarify, I'm not saying this at all to defend Hoyo, but I think it's important before we make a judgment call or anything that we have the context of what is the reasoning behind decisions involving these games that we all generally really like. And while I'm very happy to see Hong Kong as an inspiration for a game that I really like, I would also love to see regions that aren't really popularly covered in video games and media, such as Southeast Asia or parts of Africa. With that being said, Hoyo does actually do a pretty good job in terms of cultural inspirations. When they do internationally inspired regions, they really do study a lot about the culture, the mythology, the history of the place, and especially in the Genshin regions. I'm not going to speak about the main controversies, but like in terms of just the lore-wise, they do a really good job of it. With that all being said, one thing I am very glad with these Chinese-inspired regions is not generic China. As we've covered with Waifei Peninsula, it's inspired by specifically Hong Kong. But I think the game that does it actually really well is Honkai Star Rail. There's a joke that the Xianzhou ships are basically just space China, which is not wrong. But the interesting thing is that each one of those individual ships in the Xianzhou is inspired by different major regions in China. The Luofu seems to be inspired by Guangdong, or the Canton region of China, which has a focus on trade and merchants, and you can actually see Jing Yuan eating dim sum in one of the trailers. And the Yaoqing, where the Fei Xiao is from, has a majority Foxian population, a focus on the military, and a love for spicy food, which seems to be inspired by the Sichuan region of China, which has a huge military cultural history. Spicy hot pot is literally like their signature dish, and interestingly enough, foxes play a really big part in their local folklore. I'm gonna stop there because I plan to make a whole entire video about this topic once the Xianzhou becomes a main story point again in Star Rail. And what I'm trying to get at is that while we're seeing more Chinese-inspired regions in these Hoyo games, I'm glad that they're tackling it in a way that highlights specific regions in China and showing off their culture. Just like how in America, a game or a show set in New Orleans will be very different than one in New York and different from one in San Francisco. I apologize for this long tangent, but I thought it was something really important to share. But now, let's get into the actual theory portion of this Zenless video. The importance of Waifei Peninsula when it comes to the world of New Eridu is that it is all one distinct culture. Cantonese. And have you ever noticed something really unique about the Janus Quarter of New Eridu? It's really diverse. Like really culturally diverse. More so than any other region in Genshin or Star Rail. You can find a Japanese-style ramen shop near a spicy hot pot restaurant near a burger spot in the same area as a mechanic that looks like a lumberjack and an android lady with an afro that owns a jazzy record shop. But come to Waifei, it's all distinctly one culture, which brought me to an interesting conclusion that Waifei Peninsula is the Chinatown of New Eridu. New Eridu is the last surviving human city after the rest of the world was swallowed up by the Hollows, so it's reasonable to believe that survivors from nations around the old world gathered at New Eridu before the complete fall. And world history, and especially American history, will tell you, if a mass influence of immigrants/refugees come to a city, then cultural districts naturally form. And the people of Waifei probably have their origins from a nation that is basically the equivalent to the China of the old world. We do know from Yanagi's character teaser that Yanagi brought the Oni to New Eridu, and since we haven't seen many of them in the current map of the game, it stands to reason that they are probably either adapted into or made their own cultural district in New Eridu. Probably one inspired by Japan. Now, I say cultural district, but Waifei kind of looks more like the size of a major city. But to be fair, I kind of think of New Eridu less of a city and more like a state or a province. This concept of cultural districts and the gathering of survivors from the old world nations actually gives a great starting point when it comes to figuring out what the future regions of ZZZ are going to look like. Because if this is true, then Janus Quarter would be the equivalent of a downtown or city center for all of New Eridu, explaining why it's so diverse. It's the crossroads before all of these unique cultural districts. If anyone might want to look for a new life outside of their area, then the easiest place to go would be the Janus Quarter, as it already has a large variety of different people. In fact, the word Janus comes from the Roman god for beginnings, endings, transitions, and doorways, so being the connection point for all of these districts really fits. This is also reflected in real cities, as the city centers often serve as hubs for diverse populations. So if we look at Janus Quarter, the most glaring hint to the future regions of ZZZ are actually probably the most simplest thing: names. If we look through just the list of currently playable characters as of 1.7, the sheer variety of cultural names is kind of insane. Obviously, we have the Chinese-inspired names with Qingyi, Zhuyuan, and Astra Yao, whom we can assume have their familiar origins in Waifei Peninsula or the nation from the old world that immigrated to Waifei Peninsula. In fact, Astra Yao's song Wonderland Reverie is in Cantonese, which is the official language of Hong Kong. Then there are the Japanese-inspired names with Harumasa, Yanagi, and Miyabi, the Germanic-inspired names with Hugo and von Lycon, which von as a middle name is most common in German, UK-inspired names with Vivian, Alexandrina, and Ellen, Eastern European and Slavic-inspired names with Kors, Kolida, Anton, and even Belobog as well, Italian and Latin-inspired names with Caesar, Luciana, Lucy, and Poltra, and American-inspired names with Billy, Bernice, and Piper, which gives us a list of potential future regions. China/Hong Kong, which was already confirmed with Waifei, Japan, the UK, Italy, the Germanic countries, and the Slavic countries. Notice how I didn't say the US, even though I said there were US-based names. The reason why is because I believe Janus Quarter is inspired by America. Now, if you look at the actual city, it's more along the lines of a general Asian modern city, which I think was on purpose. They wanted to look as generic big city as possible, and given that Hoyo is based in Shanghai, they probably used what was around them as inspiration for a big city vibe. But if you look at the small details in terms of geography and diversity, it actually aligns a lot more with America, specifically California, because I can tell you from being there, China's not really that diverse. But within California alone, there's Chinatowns, Little Tokyo, Germantown, Wee Britain, Little Italy, and Little Russia, which covers all of the regions I mentioned, and that's like a fraction of all of the cultural cities in California alone. This wide variety of diverse cultures would make sense as a general inspiration for New Eridu if it's truly the last bastion of humanity that everyone gathered to. That would then naturally create a multitude of cultural districts. And in terms of geography, the Outer Ring is definitely inspired by the open roads throughout the southwest of the states. The trailer for the Outer Ring even showed famous scenic red rocks in New Mexico and Arizona, which is right next to Southern California, just like how the Outer Ring is just a long drive away from the Janus Quarter of New Eridu. But the most important thing that California has that is significant to ZZZ is Hollywood. And I'm not grasping at straws here. The devs made it very clear that film and media play a huge role in the inspirations for Zenless. Every faction in ZZZ is inspired by famous video game and movie tropes. Cops, phantom thieves, biker gangs, idols, special forces. Hell, all of the Victoria housekeeping members are all references to different horror movie tropes. And what type of store do the siblings run again? A video store. So it stands to reason that the stories in the future regions in ZZZ might take place in settings inspired by famous movie tropes. And lo and behold, every country I mentioned that might be inspirations for future regions are the origins or settings for a lot of famous movie tropes. Hong Kong, as I mentioned before, is the home of Kung Fu films. It's already been confirmed in the story that Waifei Peninsula will have mysticism and martial arts as a key point in the story. And honestly, the design of Waifei reminds me specifically of Hong Kong movies in the 1990s and the 2000s. Japan is where anime culture is from, and the classic tropes of katanas, samurais, and ninjas have their origins. Germanic and Norse folklore is a huge influence in anything Dungeons and Dragons. The Slavic countries and Russia are the settings for a lot of spy and secret agent films, and their folklore is the basis for a lot of horror movies. Italy is the center of any Renaissance political story, and the go-to for any religious-based story, mystery, conspiracy, or otherwise. The UK is where Victorian politics come from, the home of Sherlock Holmes, and anything that has to do with Celtic or Arthurian knight legends. And at the crossroads for all these cultural districts that's inspired by different film tropes is the Janus Quarter, New Eridu's Hollywood. And the siblings, who are video store owners, are going around each district living out their stories. And how poetic is that? And that's the theory for today. If you made it this far in this video, thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you like these types of explanations for like the inspirations for games. If you guys like it, I might try it more in the future. As always, let me know your own thoughts and theories in the comments below. Let me know if you're looking forward to season 2 of ZZZ. And with that all being said, peace.